She only needed one evening, a single performance, a borrowed name, a shield she could return in the morning. The Duke of Blackridge agreed, and then forgot to stop. If you've ever watched a woman walk into humiliation alone and wished someone would step beside her, subscribe now. Because in this story, protection has a price, and it may cost more than either of them expects. London, April 1841, the height of the season. Robert Hawthorne, Duke of Blackridge, had 3 inviolable rules for surviving society: never encourage emotional dependency in anyone foolish enough to offer it. Never allow gossip, however vicious, to dictate his movements, and under absolutely no circumstances attach his name to scandal, a scheme, or a woman in distress. On the evening of Lady Davenport's spring ball, he violated all 3 before the second waltz. And the Mayfair ballroom had been arranged with the particular cruelty of people who wished to be observed admiring beautiful things. Chandeliers dripped light onto gilded mirrors. Violins climbed over the low hum of calculated conversation. Women moved in silk and ambition, men in tailored restraint. Reputation here was not merely currency. It was oxygen. Breathe wrong, and society would watch you suffocate with polite fascination. Robert had attended because Parliament's Easter recess had left him with nothing to occupy his evenings except ledgers he had already memorized, and correspondence he had already ignored. He required 3 signatures on a rural land bill. 2 were secured. The third belonged to Baron Butterfield, a quietly influential man who was rumored to appear tonight, trailing the usual cloud of financial anxiety and an overlooked daughter nobody seemed able to place. Though he had not intended to notice either of them. He had managed precisely 40 minutes of strategic conversation and 1 glass of champagne he had not touched when the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It began with a laugh, a sharp, carrying laugh, the kind designed to be heard, from a woman in plum silk who was addressing a small circle of guests near the refreshment table. Robert registered the sound the way one registers a door left carelessly open, as an intrusion he had not invited. Then he registered what was being laughed at. A young woman in pale pink stood at the center of the circle, her spine straight, her chin lifted in the careful posture of someone refusing to flinch. She was not beautiful in the expected season fashion. She was something quieter than that and more composed. But her eyes, dark, quick, and currently absorbing humiliation with extraordinary dignity, moved once across the room as if searching for an exit that did not require her to walk through the circle of people enjoying her discomfort. "It is no mystery," the woman in plum was saying, her voice bright with manufactured sympathy. "Why, no gentleman has put his name on her card. One hears things." The suitor beside Sandra Butterfield excused himself. Visibly. In front of everyone, Robert watched her shoulders absorb the impact of that small, devastating exit. Watched her father across the room, pale, useless, already retreating toward a column to study his shoes. He set down his untouched champagne. He had not intended this. She crossed toward him before he could form a coherent objection to his own feet moving. The crowd parted. Not for her, but for him. And she stepped into the gap with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the walk and refused to let her hands shake during it. Up close, she was more unsettling than expected. The dignity he had observed from across the room was not performance. It was controlled desperation, and it was running out. "Your Grace?" Her voice was low, steady, remarkable, given the circumstances. "I'm going to ask you something extraordinary. You are welcome to refuse." A beat. "But I would ask that you hear me first." He should have refused immediately. He did not. "Miss Butterfield," he said, because he had apparently retained her name despite having no interest in doing so. "You have 30 seconds. She took 22, and when she finished, when she had laid out her proposition in the quietest, most precise act of social audacity he had witnessed in 15 years of ballrooms. Robert Hawthorne, Duke of Blackridge, who did not perform, did not rescue, and did not attach himself to other people's disasters, did something that surprised even him. He lifted her gloved hand to his lips, slowly, deliberately, in full view of Lady Davenport's assembled guests. "Very well, Miss Butterfield," he said, just loud enough for the nearest cluster of observers to carry the words outward like ripples in still water. "Let us give them something to discuss." He led her onto the floor. The dance began. So did everything he could not take back. But to understand why Robert Hawthorne, a man who had spent 41 years constructing a life with no weakness in it, followed a baron's daughter onto a ballroom floor at the cost of every rule he had ever made, one must go back to what neither of them said aloud that evening, to what Sandra Butterfield was truly running from, and to what the Duke of Blackridge had decided in the space of 22 seconds that he was willing to risk. And he danced the way he did everything else, with complete, unhurried control. His hand settled at her waist, and Sandra registered two things simultaneously: that it was positioned with perfect propriety, and that it felt nothing like propriety. There was no tentative distance in it, no polite suggestion of guidance. It was a statement. She is here. She is accounted for. Adjust your assumptions accordingly. Society adjusted immediately, so she could feel it, the subtle reorientation of the room's attention, like iron filings shifting toward a magnet. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-flutter. The woman in plum silk, her cousin Eleanor, stood at the edge of the floor with an expression that Sandra quietly archived for later. "Lift your chin," Robert said, close enough that the words arrived without reaching anyone else. "You are being watched by 43 people. Do not let them see you counting them." "I wasn't counting. You were." 43. "I've already assessed each one." A pause, measured as everything else about him. The Baron near the East Pillar is Whitmore. He controls 3 county seats and dislikes displays of social weakness. Smile, not at me. At the room. She smiled at the room. "Your father holds influence in 4 rural parishes," he continued, turning her smoothly through the step. "Influence I require for a land bill before Parliament rises in June. He is unaware I know this. You will remain unaware as well." So, there it was. Sandra had suspected a transaction. She had not expected it delivered with such clean efficiency while waltzing. "We both benefit then," she said. "We both benefit," he agreed. No warmth in it. No apology either. It should have made her feel used. Strangely, it made her feel steadier. A business arrangement she understood, and a business arrangement had rules. The music turned. His hand at her waist did not loosen. If anything, it did the opposite. She told herself it was performance. She almost believed it. The trouble arrived in the form of Viscount Crane, a narrow, florid man who intercepted them at the edge of the floor as the waltz concluded, his smile carrying the particular warmth of someone delivering an insult he had already enjoyed privately. "Miss Butterfield?" He bowed, barely. "I understand your father's estate has had a difficult season. One hopes the Butterfield name hasn't become altogether inconvenient." The word landed like a coin dropped on marble. Sandra opened her mouth. Robert spoke first. She would not be able to reconstruct afterward exactly what was said, only that it was quiet, precise, and delivered with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once doubted that his words would have consequences. Within the space of 4 sentences, Viscount Crane's political alliances, social debts, and a particular matter involving a banking house in Edinburgh had all been placed, gently, publicly, on the table. Crane went pale. He withdrew. Robert turned back to Sandra as if nothing had occurred. His hand had not released hers through any of it. It did not release it now. By Thursday, society had decided for them. Sandra became aware of it gradually, the way one becomes aware of weather changing, and not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small signals. A morning caller who asked, with elaborate casualness, how long she had been acquainted with the Duke of Blackridge. An invitation to Lady Forsyth's soiree that had not arrived last season and arrived now on cream paper with a gilt edge, addressed to her specifically. Her father, who had not looked directly at her in 3 weeks, suddenly finding reasons to occupy the same rooms she did. Eleanor watched all of it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Sandra found Robert at the edge of Hyde Park on Wednesday morning, where he rode every day at the same hour, with the predictability of a man who considered spontaneity a moral failing. She did not dismount. Neither did he. This was meant to be temporary, she said without preamble. He regarded her with the patience of someone who had anticipated the conversation and found it mildly beneath his concern. It is temporary. Everything in a season is temporary. You know what I mean. I know you are uncomfortable with what is working. I am uncomfortable, she said carefully, with something that has grown beyond what I agreed to. For a moment he said nothing. The horses shifted. Somewhere in the park, children were arguing over a hoop. Then do not look at me, Robert said, as if you wish it were not. She left before she could confirm or deny it. Lady Forsyth's soiree was candlelight and cut crystal and the low, dangerous hum of gathered intelligence. Sandra arrived with her father, who was immediately absorbed by a circle of rural landowners. Robert's doing, she suspected, though she could not prove it. She did not see him for the first hour. She felt him before she saw him. The room's subtle recalibration, the way conversations adjusted their angles, and then his hand, settling at her waist from behind. That's where he had appeared without announcement, without asking, with the ease of someone who had decided the gesture required no permission. The Earl of Dunmore is watching, he said quietly, close to her ear. He controls the 3rd county seat I mentioned. Look as though you belong exactly where you are. She felt it then. Not safety, not quite comfort. Something older than both. The particular unease of being claimed before you have decided to give yourself. She belonged nowhere he had placed her, and yet her body had not moved away. That was the part she could not account for. The gallery above the main hall was lit by a single row of sconces, warm and remote from the crowd below. Sandra had gone up to breathe. She had not heard him follow, but when she turned, he was already there. Closer than occasion required, the noise of the soiree distant beneath them, the rest of London entirely irrelevant. "Your Grace." "Robert," he said, for the word landed quietly. Like the first move of a game she had not agreed to play, the gallery held the particular silence of a room that existed above consequence. Below, crystal rang against crystal. Laughter rose and dissolved. Society performed itself with tireless dedication. Up here, there was only the two of them and the uncomfortable fact of the distance closing between them. "You followed me," Sandra said. "I was already here." "You were not." She turned to face him fully. See, because allowing him to exist behind her felt like a concession she could not afford. "You followed me, and I would like you to explain the purpose of that." "Observation." He said it without apology. "You left the room with the expression of someone preparing an argument. I preferred to hear it in private." "How considerate." She kept her voice even. "Then here is the argument. You are forgetting this is an act." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise. Robert Hawthorne did not appear to be capable of surprise, or if he was, he had long since trained the expression out of his face. It was something quieter than surprise, more deliberate. He took one step closer. The sconces threw his shadow long across the gallery floor. "And what part," he said, "feels false?" Sandra opened her mouth and found, with some alarm, that the answer was more complicated than it had been 3 days ago. "The arrangement," she said. "The terms. The fact that this began as a transaction and you have allowed it to become... She stopped, searched for the word. Something else. I have allowed nothing. His voice was low. Things become what they are, regardless of what we call them. That is a very convenient philosophy for a man in your position, and an inconvenient truth for a woman in yours. She should have stepped back, and the space between them had contracted to something that no longer resembled the acceptable geography of a private conversation. She was aware of it the way one is aware of a change in air pressure. Not quite tangible, not quite avoidable. She did not step back. Neither did he. When he kissed her, it was not the performance she might have half expected. Not the careful, controlled gesture of a man making a strategic point. There was nothing calculated in it. So his hand came up to the line of her jaw, and he kissed her the way he had placed his hand at her waist at the soiree, without asking, without hesitation, with the complete assurance of someone who had already decided, possessively. She had one clear thought. This was not part of the agreement, and then the thought dissolved, because she was kissing him back, and that was the more pressing problem. She did not know how much time passed. She knew when footsteps sounded on the gallery stairs. 2 sets, unhurried, accompanied by voices carrying the self-important murmur of guests seeking a quieter corner. They separated. Sandra turned toward the window, pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth as if she could rearrange the evidence. Behind her, she heard Robert adjust his cuffs with the composure of a man who had not just done something irreversible. The guests arrived. He saw the Duke of Blackridge standing in quiet contemplation of the street below, and a young woman beside him doing the same, and retreated with murmured apologies. They descended to the ballroom in silence, resumed their respective positions among society as if nothing had shifted. But it had. Sandra understood that now with uncomfortable clarity. This had never been a performance for her, and he had known it longer than she had. So what existed between them was no longer strategy dressed in courtesy. It was territory. And somewhere between the first waltz and this gallery, she had stopped being a visitor in it. If you think that kiss was harmless, you're not paying attention. Pretending is safe until someone forgets the rules. Subscribe now, because the next move he makes will either ruin her or bind her forever. And if you disagree, tell me in the comments why you think she should run. It happened on a Friday, and at the Countess of Ashwell's dinner party, which was precisely the kind of event where reputations were most efficiently destroyed. Too intimate for rumor to be dismissed as ballroom noise, too formal for the accused to make a scene without compounding the damage. Sandra did not see it coming. She should have. She knew Eleanor. The letters surfaced between the soup course and the fish, and Sandra became aware of them the way one becomes aware of fire, first as a vague warmth in the room's atmosphere, then as something with heat and direction, conversations turning, glances sliding away before they could be caught, the particular quality of silence that spreads when a group of people are all pretending they have not just heard the same thing. She found the source in Eleanor, who stationed near the window with a small cluster of women around her like satellites around something giving off light. Her cousin's voice was arranged into an expression of reluctant concern, the performance of a woman sharing something she wished she didn't have to. She wrote them herself, Eleanor was saying, producing a folded page with the careful hesitation of a woman who had rehearsed the gesture. I would not have shared them naturally, but given what is being assumed about her and the Duke, one feels a responsibility to the truth. The letter was passed. Read. Reacted to in small, controlled ways that nonetheless rippled outward. Sandra had written those letters at 19, to Eleanor herself, the same cousin now deploying them as ammunition. She had written about feeling invisible in her own house, about the terror of being handed to a man for his income rather than his character, about wanting, simply, to be chosen rather than assigned. Private words. True words. Now rearranged into evidence of a woman unstable, grasping and wholly unsuitable for a duke's serious consideration. The whispers reached Sandra before the room could rearrange itself into politeness. She stood very still. She had practiced stillness her whole life, in drawing rooms, at dinner tables, in every space where being overlooked was preferable to being noticed for the wrong reason. She called on it now, and it came, but only just. Eleanor caught her eye across the room, and smiled. Robert had not moved from his position near the fireplace. He did not need to move to observe. He watched the geometry of the room shift, guests redistributing themselves away from Sandra with the instinctive, unconscious cruelty of people protecting their own association, and understood within seconds what had occurred and what it would cost her. This was not flirtation with consequence anymore, and this was deliberate demolition. Sandra stood at the center of it, alone, her chin lifted at an angle he recognized by now. Not confidence, but its well-practiced imitation, held together by will and very little else. He set down his glass and moved. He crossed the room without urgency. That was the part Sandra would remember afterward. Not the declaration itself, but the quality of his movement toward it. Unhurried, inevitable, the way a tide does not rush because it does not need to. That he reached her side and did not look at her. He looked at the room. "Ladies and gentlemen." Robert did not raise his voice. He never needed to. There was a register he employed in certain moments. Parliament, she would later learn, had named it privately among themselves, that compelled silence the way a change in weather compels attention. Not loudly, simply as a fact of nature. The room obliged. "I am aware that a matter of correspondence has been circulated this evening, touching on Miss Butterfield's private character." He allowed a pause. Not for drama, she understood, but because he was a man who gave words room to settle before adding more. "I will address it briefly, as it does not warrant more than that." The letter Eleanor had been curating so carefully had stopped moving between hands, frozen mid-circulation, the way all contraband freezes when authority enters the room. Miss Butterfield's private sentiments are precisely that, private, and will remain so, as befitting a woman who will shortly become the Duchess of Blackridge. Another pause. Quieter now, more absolute. "Miss Butterfield will be my wife." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting. It was the silence of a room that had stopped breathing. Sandra felt it move through her in layers. First, the pure physical shock of it. Her chest, her hands, something behind her eyes. Second, the room's response rippling outward like a stone dropped in still water. Her father, across the table, had gone entirely white, his fork suspended halfway to a plate he had forgotten. Eleanor, she found her cousin's face by instinct, had lost all color, the careful arrangement of her expression finally failing her. Society around them was visibly, frantically recalculating. The letters were folded away, discreetly, rapidly. The damage was not merely neutralized, it was erased, repainted, and rehung as something else entirely. Robert stood beside her with the settled composure of a man who had weighed every variable and found the solution adequate. He had not looked at her once. Later, she could not have said how much later, time having become unreliable, she found him in the corridor outside the dining room, where he had stepped briefly from the reformed warmth of a society now eager to congratulate him. She stopped in front of him. She had prepared something measured, something precise and cutting that conveyed the full architecture of what he had done without betraying how badly her hands were shaking beneath her gloves. What came out instead was quieter than she intended. "I asked you," Sandra said, "to pretend." He looked at her then. For the first time all evening, something in his expression moved, almost imperceptibly beneath the composure, like fault lines shifting below the surface of very still ground. And he said nothing, which was, she was learning, its own kind of answer. She came to Blackridge House the following morning, unchaperoned, unannounced. At an hour when calling was not yet socially sanctioned, which meant the butler received her with visible uncertainty, and Robert received her with none at all. As if he had been expecting her, or had simply decided that surprise was a luxury he could no longer afford around her. He received her in his study, and it was a room that suited him entirely. Dark wood, ordered shelves, nothing decorative that did not also serve a function. A fire burned low in the grate. Papers were arranged on the desk with the precision of a man who experienced disorder as a personal failing. He did not sit. Neither did she. "I want the truth," Sandra said. "Not the version you've constructed for society. Not the version that reflects best on your judgment." She held his gaze steadily. "The truth. You'll need to be more specific." "Do you love me?" she said, "or do you simply refuse to lose?" The question arrived in the room and stayed there. Robert turned toward the window. It was a small movement, barely perceptible. But she had learned to read the small movements because they were all he permitted himself. His hands, clasped behind his back, tightened briefly. "I did not intend to propose," he said at last. I know. I want you to understand what I mean by that." He turned back. Something in his face had shifted. Not broken, precisely, but no longer entirely fortified. The composure was still present. It was simply no longer doing all the work alone. "I did not plan it. I did not calculate it. I looked at that room, at what your cousin had arranged, at the way you were standing in the center of it." He stopped, started again more carefully. "I am not accustomed to acting without calculation. And yet. The words came out with the quality of an admission he had not rehearsed. "I saw you about to be destroyed by something you did not deserve, in a room full of people who would have watched it happen and called it entertainment, and I—" Another pause. "Longer. I acted out of fear." Sandra had not expected that word from him. She was not certain she had expected it from anyone. "Fear of what?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "Of losing something I had not yet admitted I wanted. A beat. Of watching you humiliated and being the man who stood at a careful distance and allowed it. Of wanting something I cannot quantify or legislate or control." The last word landed with particular weight, as if it cost him more than the others. "You are the only thing in the last 20 years that I have not been able to control, including my response to you." The fire shifted in the grate. Sandra let the silence hold for a moment, not cruelly, but because it deserved space. "You protected me from scandal," she said finally. "I understand why. I even understand the impulse." She held her ground, voice steady as she had trained it to be in every room that had ever tried to make her small. "But you decided my future without asking me. You placed your name over mine like a verdict and called it rescue." He did not argue. He did not redirect or qualify or reframe, and he simply listened. And that, Sandra realized, was more disarming than anything else he had done. The Duke of Blackridge, who commanded rooms and silenced viscounts and bent Parliament to his precision, stood in his own study and received her words without deflection. It did not resolve anything, but it changed the shape of what remained. If you've stayed this long, you already know this isn't just romance. It's about power and choice. Stories like this don't survive without your support. Being subscribed now, because if she walks away next, you won't want to miss why. And if you think she should refuse him completely, write it below. I want to see who still believes love is enough. She chose Lady Davenport's ball, deliberately. The same room where it had begun, 6 weeks prior, with a desperate proposition and a gloved hand lifted to his lips. Sandra had spent 2 days considering the venue and concluded that symmetry was not sentimentality. It was clarity. And if something was to be corrected, it ought to be corrected where it had been set in motion. She arrived without Robert. That alone was enough to reorient the room. She did not rush it. She accepted a glass of champagne she did not intend to drink, exchanged pleasantries with Lady Forsyth, acknowledged 2 invitations she would consider later, and she allowed society to settle into its assumption that this was an ordinary evening, that the recently announced future Duchess of Blackridge had arrived to be congratulated and admired and absorbed into the machinery of her new station. Then she set down her glass and spoke clearly enough to be heard by the nearest 3 clusters of guests, which in a room with Lady Davenport's acoustics meant effectively everyone. I want to address something directly, and as I find indirectness tends to complicate matters that are already sufficiently complicated. She did not perform. She did not raise her voice into theatre. She simply spoke the way she had learned to stand, without apology, without performance, with nothing to recommend her but the words themselves. The Duke of Blackridge has offered me marriage. Publicly and without prior consultation. A breath. I have not yet accepted. The silence arrived instantly and completely. Somewhere near the pianoforte, a woman's fan snapped shut. A duke's offer of marriage, refused, hesitated over, questioned. The room processed it with the collective expression of people encountering a word in a language they had always assumed they spoke fluently and suddenly could not pass. Eleanor, Sandra noted peripherally, had gone rigid near the east wall. She did not look at her long. She had not known Robert was present until the crowd shifted. No, he had been there. Of course he had been there. And he moved through the parting guests with the same unhurried inevitability she had catalogued that first evening. The room watched him the way it always watched him, with the particular attention reserved for forces of nature and men who had never once required its approval. He stopped before her, and he bowed. Not the shallow social acknowledgement of an equal. A genuine, deliberate bow, unhurried, unambiguous, once in full view of every person in the room. When he straightened, his voice carried the same register he used in Parliament, except quieter, as if this particular declaration was for her first and the room second, which was, she understood, something that had never been true before tonight. If she refuses me, he said, I will accept it. The room erupted softly around them. Sandra looked at him. He was not claiming. He was not commanding or calculating or constructing. So he was standing before her with his composure entirely intact and his power entirely surrendered. He was, for the first time, simply asking. He came at dawn, not to Butterfield House. That would have been improper, and Robert Hawthorne had apparently decided that he had exhausted his quota of impropriety for one season. He sent a note instead, 3 lines in a hand she recognized by now as his. Precise, unornamented, no salutation. The East Garden of Grosvenor Square. 7 o'clock, though you are not obligated to come. That last sentence alone told her more than the rest of it. She came. London at dawn was a different city. The performance had not yet begun. No carriages, no calling cards, no society arranging itself into visibility. Just grey light softening over stone, the smell of damp earth, and somewhere distant the first mundane sounds of a city remembering how to be ordinary. Robert was already there, standing at the garden's edge without his hat, and which struck her as the most unguarded she had ever seen him. He turned when he heard her approach and did not arrange his expression before she could read it. That, too, was new. They stood for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have already said most of the difficult things and are now facing what remains. I did not mean to take it too far, he said. No preamble. No political architecture around it. I know, she said. I don't think you do. Ah, not entirely. He looked at her with the steadiness she had once read as coldness and now understood was simply the way he looked at the few things he took seriously. I agreed to your arrangement because it was rational. It had clear terms and mutual benefit, and a definable conclusion. I am comfortable with those conditions. A pause. I became uncomfortable very quickly. "The dance," she said. "Before the dance." The admission arrived without drama. That's when you walked across that ballroom alone, with nothing except your own nerve, and asked me for help without asking me for pity. I had not encountered that before. He exhaled slowly. Somewhere between that evening and everything that followed, I stopped performing. I could not locate the exact moment. I only know that by the gallery, I'd forgotten there was a performance at all. Sandra was quiet. She thought about everything she had asked for. One evening, a borrowed shield, and a temporary reprieve. She thought about what she had not asked for. A man who dismantled viscounts on her behalf, who kissed her as if the act required no audience, who stood in a ballroom before all of London and surrendered the only currency he had ever trusted. She thought about the letters Eleanor had exposed, private and true and used against her, afraid of being assigned rather than chosen, and here, in a garden at dawn, and with no witnesses and no politics and nothing to recommend the moment except its honesty, she was being chosen. "Ask me," she said. He did. Simply, plainly, without a ring or a speech or the performance of certainty. Sandra placed her hand in his. London would talk for the rest of the season, and likely into the next. The scandal would be retold, embellished, debated over dinner tables and in morning rooms from Mayfair to Marylebone. A baron's daughter who hesitated over a duke, and a duke who bowed. None of it would be entirely accurate. But as Robert's hand closed around hers in the grey morning quiet, Sandra found she did not particularly mind what London said. She had not been rescued. She had not been claimed. She had walked across a ballroom once on nothing but nerve. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, so had he. They had both, in the end, chosen. That was the only version of the story that belonged to them. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.